Welcome back to the last panel today. And if the US was the USA has invented the concept of speed dating, my belief is that today we're inventing the concept of speed paneling and speed thinking. Let me introduce my very distinguished panel here. JD, I reintroduce you because you're the ambassador who's known and represented the US in 3 Germanys, and you're only surpassed by Fritz Stern, who's known 5 Germanys, actually. And if I may say so, if you allow me this remark, I really would not like you to know more than these 3 Germanys, because I can say I'm quite happy with the one we have now.
Yeah, let's keep it.
Let's keep the one. Yeah, we're doing good with this one. Diana Pinto is, in many senses, a true European. Born to Italian parents, she lives in France. She is European in the sense that she was educated in the US. She is a very well-known intellectual. Her most recent book is Israel Has Moved, which I thought was a really nice title, and I'm, of course, curious to know where it might have moved to. And last but not least, Amichai Magen is Israeli. He's head of the political development and senior researcher at the International Institute for Counterterrorism, ICT, and you're also a scholar at Hoover Institution in Stanford. We're very happy to have you here. My name is Sylke Tempel. I'm with the German Council on Foreign Relations. Having followed the panels today, I thought we're becoming a bit too harmonious, because so far, really, what we have figured out is we might use at times different operating systems. You know, some of us, Germany, Israel, or the US, might use operating systems called Snow Leopard or Lion, but we can all agree that we all use Macs. And the more I listened into this by trying to figure out the slight differences in the software here, and perhaps sometimes a little bit in the hardware there, but not much, I was thinking to myself whether or not being too optimistic, really. Because if I listen in on the conversations within Germany, and I'm sure, Diana, this is very much true for much of the European public, on Israel or on the United States, the title that we have for this panel, you know, Israel, an outpost of the West in the Middle East, might even be a bit overly optimistic, to say the least. Because when I'm listening in on the conversations on Israel, there's a stronger and stronger feeling among many Germans, Europeans, that Israel, or at least there's some questioning whether Israel really still belongs to the community of those countries who share in Western values, because Israel is mainly perceived as an occupying force, or if I want to be polite, you know, as a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, where it might be a functioning, wonderful democracy within Israel proper, but certainly a Mr. Hyde in the occupied territories. And I'd really like to ask you, Diana, to go first, whether this notion of Israel being an outpost might be a bit too optimistic, whether something fundamental and really profound has changed in our conversations about Israel as a Western country, or later on about America as our transatlantic partner, and whether there is still a huge and reliable majority in these societies who would see Israel a part of the Western world in the sense of we're sharing the same values.
Yes, I shall try to be as brief as possible. Well, what a title for our epoch. I mean, everything in that title is in perfect transformation right now as we speak. Israel, the West, and the Middle East. I don't think of anything stable except perhaps the article "an" in that sentence. I mean, really, Israel in itself, in a sense, right now, must be very grateful to Putin and the Ukraine for having put the peace process talks sort of on the back burner. The Middle East, I won't even mention the chaos it's in. And the West is perhaps fractured or maybe trying to recombine itself. And the future lies in the answer to these 3 words. It's the gas, stupid. And we shall see where the gas plays in creating a West again. Now, very quickly, I think the notion of the outpost is one that is only partial. And one has to look at these issues of Israel, the West, and the Middle East from both the inside Israeli perspective and the external one, whether it be European or American. And I played with 5 categories that I think are all pertinent to where Israel stands in this particular triangle. And en passant, I should say I'm very grateful to be invited to this conference because I'm kind of an insider-outsider since I'm neither an Israeli nor a German, not really an American anymore. So anyway, the Outpost. That is the first category I will look at very briefly. Then there's a second one that I would call the epitome. A third one which I would call the antithesis. A fourth one which I would call the prefiguration. And a fifth one which I would call the avant-garde. The Outpost, in primitive terms, is the place that's rough and tough on the border, incarnating something about an older headquarters. And so is Israel the outpost? That would imply that the West has put a piece of itself in a very dangerous territory, a pioneer in a hostile world border, but of course reflecting the original Western message. Is this still true? It is to be discussed. One can say, well, if Israel is the outpost, it might be the outpost of a 19th century ethnic state notion of an identity. Or one can say that this is a major dividing issue between Europeans and Americans. For the Europeans, as Sylke mentioned, we shall say that Israel, given its tough neighborhood, incarnates the values, but it's more difficult to apply them. In other words, it's an imperfect Venus. For the Americans, instead, it is a super Mars. Either way, I think something is missing if one looks at it from the inside in terms of Israel's own internal identity. I'm not sure Israel sees itself as the outpost of anyone. I think Israel sees itself as Israel. Now, the second one is the epitome, and it's quite different from being the outpost. The epitome is that Israel contains in its miracle and in its identity not just a pretty good adaptation of Western values, but really a sublime ability to incarnate some of the loftier values of humanity, and doing it remarkably. And I think Chief Justice Beinisch really incarnates what one has always said about Israel, the miracle of the Supreme Court. But it's also, one can say, it's got the most brilliant civil society. How is that to be one of the top leading cities of the lonely planet when it is really a lonely state sometimes? And the most ethical army, anyway, an army that has a code of ethics that has been hammered out by some of the very best philosophers of the land. The most open, absorbing country for the vast immigration, generally Jewish, but now with the new immigrants somewhat different. The most dynamic in scientific and medical terms, the most high-tech advanced society. So these are all characteristics that would go into the epitome and not doing more or less what an outpost can be. Then we have the antithesis. Now, I need not tell you who believes in the antithesis for Israel. You have the entire, boycott movement. You have those who are anti-Semites. You have the anti-Zionists. That's not the point of speaking about them here. But I would like to say that inside Israel itself, there is a strong current of people, mainly religious, some ultranationalists, who do not believe that the burning bush and the agora are compatible, and that if one has to decide what an Israeli Jewish identity in Israel is, the burning bush is more important, and that Greek democracy and Jewish identity are not necessarily compatible. So the whole issue of being an antithesis to the West is a relevant one, even within Israel, not just the enemies of Israel. That pluralism and equality are not necessarily desirable, that in a way there is a theological meaning to Zionism, and that the real incarnations of Israel piggybacked on the Zionist project, but are going into the messianic notions of the state, whose borders are biblically defined and not in terms of international relations or law. The fourth category is the prefiguration. And here you can say that Europeans and Americans might be looking at Israel differently, especially since 9/11. Israel was there before. Border security, hijackings, terrorism, the need for surveillance, the need for a strong army, the need for a technological avant-garde that could be put to safety use. And there was, in the first years of the years 2000s, even in Europe, a feeling of, Israel, we've got a lot to learn from Israel, mainly for security issues. And there was something about this prefiguration which gave it a power that the West had to learn, because Israel knew better since it had really been living in the nasty context, whereas one had to have 2 towers destroyed in America to realize fully how nasty the context could be. The prefiguration is a negative one, essentially. It's not so much about the positive content, but about the fact that Israel has been facing the real world and that the West must learn to do the same. The fifth one, and I'm really being extremely brief here, is the notion of Israel as an avant-garde, and it has nothing to do with prefiguration. It has to do with Israel's own rise to an incredible, small, but power that is no longer, as Amichai had mentioned in a previous conversation, the small, poor country down the road, semi-European, perhaps modern, with many problems. An Israeli strength that can be built on the high technology, on the state, on gas, you call it what you want, and you can fill in those blanks. But a strong, tough, independent state capable of carrying on its own trajectory. And here you have a contradiction, which is that the state need not be the maximum amount or mathematics of the civil society. The state can have its own base, spinal column, needs, interests, and trajectories. And the notion that one can love the civil society and, of course, the state as a parenthesis can be somewhat and often a dangerous one, not just in Israel, but elsewhere, of course. And if one looks at the politics of today, it is interesting to see that Israel, and this is what I mean by the avant-garde, has enough components in itself as a nation to go at it alone in great part, or at any rate to navigate with beyond the West. It can navigate in more international waters. It can move toward China. It can move toward India. It can move where it wants. It can have the closer ties to Russia. It need not be stuck in our own small, complex, perhaps decadent, pluralist, democratic West, which is not to say the Israeli civil society, of whom there are so many incarnations here, isn't Western, but I'm simply trying to say in a Hobbesian manner that the state need not be the civil society, and that one can move toward China, which is fascinated by Israel, and not have to stay stuck under the shadow of the United States. This is a message that American Jews and Americans on the whole do not like to hear at all, because the link is supposed to be indissoluble. I make the argument, especially as I said it with Israel has moved, that if you look at 5,000 years of Jewish history, if they left Iraq for Charlemagne's court, why must Israel be stuck in a kind of decadent, fatigued West when it can move where opportunity, strength may be elsewhere? So, I mean, to be really very brief, and I just launched you 5 provocations. The analysis can be given to you, but in another century, in another country, in another time, I gather. Is it an outpost? Perhaps, but not really, or only in part. Is it an antithesis? Maybe. Is it an avant-garde? Absolutely, but perhaps not within our common little world as we know it.
Thank you so very much for your provocations, and I'm sure we'll be picking up on some of them. At least later on, I would like to come back to the question of more options with other countries. But before we do this, I still would like to pick up on something you'd said. While a while ago, especially for Europeans, Israel seemed to be an example in many regards. By now, it seems to me, especially in the public discourse, that Israel very often is seen as the country that hasn't learned the lessons of the 21st century, in the sense of Germany/Europe has become post-nationalist, post-militaristic, and post-religious in many senses. And I'm not talking about secularism. I'm talking about a German public that's basically amusical when it comes to religious tones, which doesn't understand what Fania said about a treasure trove that lies in the Hebrew Bible, but would sort of dispose of it as something very backwards. And I would like to ask you, Amichai, about these 3 concepts. Would you say that these would be correct observations up to a certain extent, because they describe 3 different contexts, because both the US and Israel are not post-nationalistic. Israel certainly is. It cannot afford to be, because it doesn't have really secure and clear borders and clearly defined borders yet. It cannot be post-militaristic. The situation certainly doesn't allow this. And it's certainly, in many different regards, as we've seen in the panel before, it certainly is not post-religious. Could we say that some of the non-understanding and the non-conversation that's happening between Europe and Israel is due to these factors?
Wow.
Well, that's my job to wow you.
Yeah.
Well, let me first of all say that as a Sabra, as a native Israeli of German ancestry who did his graduate work at Stanford in the United States, this triangle, this Israeli-German-American triangle is very meaningful to me, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here. I also want to make the observation that while this is a German-American-Israeli conference, we're very much operating on standard Israeli time rather than standard German time, which probably explains why we have so little time.
Amichai, and since I'm German in this regard, I have to speed you up.
And why Sylke is being is whipping us here with very, very direct questions. I am hoping, Sylke, you will allow me to say a few things, something about the nature of the West, if I may.
If it's short.
It's not. Well, I wanted to say something about the nature of the West and the miracle of the West. I think it's very relevant. I also think that when we talk about Israel and the West, it's enormously important not to begin the story in 1948, but to look at Hebraic political tradition, Hebraic political thought, and the contribution of Judaism to the formation of the West, and that was going to be sort of a substantial component of what I wanted to say. And then thirdly, the final thing I wanted to say again, if you'll allow me, is to try to explain this discomfort, this sense that Dayan says in some respects Israel is a hyper-Western a vanguard of the West, and so why this great discomfort? Given that time is short, perhaps I could say something about this sense of discomfort, and hopefully it will really launch us into the conversation that we the direction that you're taking us into. But it does mean that I'm throwing away some really wonderful stuff.
That's sort of live copy and paste on Palo, yeah.
You know the joke that what's the difference between, I just came from Palo Alto, so what's the difference between an American software engineer, a Chinese software engineer, and an Israeli software engineer? That the American software engineer, and it sort of goes to this point, tries to think outside of the box. The Chinese software engineer, and I hope I'm not offending anybody here, really struggles to think of outside of the box, and the Israeli is not aware that the box exists. So I will try to live up to our national reputation of adaptability by making these three strong points. So why this dissonance, right? Why this great sense of discomfort? And here, I think it is very important to understand that we have these moving pieces, right? That the West is not a static concept. Much of the discomfort has nothing to do with Israel, but I think it has to do with the discomfort that Europe and the United States feels with its own global situation, with its own values. People are speaking increasingly about a crisis of liberal democracy, about a crisis of governance in the West, a sort of a growing sense that the West is not only losing its percentage of GDP in the global economy and its global dominance, which is really very recent and very atypical historically, but also that there's a sort of a deeper spiritual crisis in the West. I think a lot of this discomfort has very little to do with Israel and has much more to do with that crisis in the West. Let me make these three points and then stop there and leave as much time as we can for conversation. First, I think that there is a tremendous amount of ignorance and discomfort about the notion of Israel being a Jewish state, and we had some informal conversations about that. I think there is a deep misunderstanding in Europe and the United States about the nature of Jewishness in this context, that it is neither purely a religion, nor an ethnicity, nor nationality per se. And there's also a sense that a Jewish state cannot be fully democratic. Which I believe is wrong, but I think as an Israeli, we've done a terrible job at explaining that. In fact, within our own educational system, mostly the dominant discourse is that you have Judaism on the one hand and you have democracy on the other, and you have to sort of choose which pole you fall into. The idea that Hebraic political principles, Hebraic political thought, have been central to the formation of modern liberal democracy, that the story of the modern world, of modern liberal democracy is as much a Jewish story as it is a Christian story, is something that we as Israelis are, I think, insufficiently aware of. This has recently come up in Israel in the context of a constitutional, a legal, a legislative debate that we are having about the possibility of legislating a new basic law in Israel about Israel as the national state of the Jewish people. So I think that there is a tremendous amount of ignorance and some discomfort about this idea of Israel as a Jewish state, let alone when we talk about this notion of what does it mean for us to be a Jewish and democratic state. The second reason why I think that there's growing discomfort in this context has to do with the growing proportion within Israel of the ultra-Orthodox and the Arab as a percentage of the population. The point was already made in the panel on economics that almost 50% of the children in Israel today who are entering first grade come from either of these communities, either the ultra-Orthodox or Israeli, the Israeli Arab community. Now, even though this is not a purely sort of black and white type of issue, it does not mean that everybody who's ultra-Orthodox is not sufficiently sort of integrated into a productive modernity, etc. There is a growing sense, I believe, that unless we address that issue, that unless we manage to integrate, and some people believe that it is the IDF that will be the primary channel by which the Israeli Defense Forces, or the military service, will be the primary channel by which the ultra-Orthodox and the Israeli Arab population is sort of integrated into the Israeli, the melting pot, into sort of economically productive modernity. I challenge that idea. I don't think that it is the job of the Israeli Defense Forces to do that. I don't believe that the Israeli army is capable of doing that. In fact, I believe that by the time people enter the Israeli army, it's far too late. This is something that you have to begin much earlier. But I think that we have a mainstream Israeli society is beginning to be seriously alarmed about the relative demographic growth of populations that do not receive the mathematical and English language education that will allow them to effectively compete in the economy of the 21st century, that do not participate equally in military service, and that may not uphold ultimately liberal democratic values and the rule of law, and that unless we have a whole government approach of more successful integration of these groups, we could find ourselves within historically a very short period of time really slipping not only to the bottom of the OECD lists in terms of economic activity, but really losing our Western nature as a society. So that is a real concern that I think is creating some discomfort about the future Western affiliation of Israel. And by the way, these developments are not linear. We could reach a very dangerous tipping point in which those within Israel who do have options to connect to the global economy outside of Israel look around and see where this is going, and we could actually have a very rapid and very dangerous deterioration among those groups that are keeping Israel modern, pluralistic, liberal, and scientifically and technologically advanced. Finally, the issue of conflict and war. The issue of conflict and war, conflict and Westernism, as Victor Davis Hanson has written, have historically gone together. The West became globally dominant through the sword, through the application of physical force. Not only, but this was a major thing. That is no longer the case. Some of you, I'm sure, may have read a book called The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Runner. Or there was a movie that was made about the loneliness of the long-distance runner. When I speak about this to my students, I use this as a sort of a metaphor because I like to speak about the loneliness of the fighting democracy. Even 50 or 60 years ago, when Israel had to live in a world where there was a debate about democratic liberal values, but at the same time an acknowledgement of the need sometimes to use military force in self-defense. This was something that I think many Western countries could at least relate to. But after 2 or 3 generations of Kantian peace in Europe, after the transition of much of Latin America from authoritarian rule to liberal democracy in the 1980s and 90s, how many liberal democracies around the world today have to fight, cannot rely on just diplomacy and multilateralism? We can, perhaps South Korea understands this, perhaps Taiwan understands this, some constituencies in the United States understand this, but Israel has remained very, very lonely in this regard and very, very isolated in this regard.
With a possible exception of the US?
Yes, but it's different from the United States. It's different. The United States fights wars thousands of miles away, and it sort of has the privilege of choosing whether
until
to be,
September 11th, in a way.
Yeah, has the privilege of choosing. The United States does not fight sort of existential wars, and the United States is an important international actor. But I think that when you look at this overall trend of the pacification of much of Europe and Latin America, I believe that process of pacification is also happening in the United States. You cannot fathom a situation today in the United States where the American people will tolerate 50,000 or 60,000 casualties in the war in the way that they did. I'm not even talking about the Second World War, but even Korea and Vietnam. Now, that process of pacification is also happening within Israeli society, but unfortunately we live under conditions and in a neighborhood where occasionally the use of military force becomes necessary. And I'm not even getting into this issue of continued occupation. I think that also is an important component of trying to understand why this growing discomfort with the idea that Israel is an integral part of the world.
Can I quickly interrupt you at this point, because this is very important. Since we are trying to explore the contexts that lead to different interpretations of our value systems, which might even cause a gap sometimes. I would like to offer you 2 different contexts here that might be important. One is the context of contemporary experience that would very much relate to the fact that Israel is in a different situation when it just comes to its own security. It does not have secure borders. It never had secure borders, while Europe was, especially even after 1948, 1949, but definitely after 1989, especially this might be changing now, but especially for Poland and the Baltic states. But Germany certainly is in a situation that for the first time in Germany's history, it had only friendly neighbors. Totally different context in this, which might lead to totally different understanding as to what military means might and how this might be reflected in a value system. And the second one is a historical context in the sense of when you're talking about a concept of growing discomfort, in a growing discomfort of Jewish and democratic is not possible, how much, Diana, might that have to do with the understanding that I encounter very often in Germany that Enlightenment was understood not as a separation of religion and state, but as a liberation from religion. And that secularism, in many senses, does not mean secular in the German context very often does not mean the separation of church and state, but again, it's a-religious. It's not sometimes even anti-religious. How much does this context have to do with growing discomfort with concepts of Jewish state and the like? Would you take the first question about the context of the situation, and Diana, would you take the question about the context of historical understanding?
Yeah. With regards to Germany and the sort of comparable experiences, with Germany and Israel, I can only say this just from recent experience of visiting Germany a lot and seeking out the interaction with German colleagues. I think this is a very, very interesting moment in German sort of evolution of German national consciousness and thinking about security. On the one hand, I sense in Berlin when I visit there a tremendous and unprecedented hunger to hear from Israelis about security issues, mainly in relation to North Africa and the Middle East. There is a sense that Germans are, or at least young, talking about the 40 minus, even 50 minus demographics, are not uncomfortable talking about security issues, defense issues, and even the use of power. I think this has to do with two things. One is a kind of a natural historical sort of transition, the sort of changing of the guard, and the abandonment of sort of the post Second World War pacifism, and secondly, it has to do with Germany's growing role as once again the lead nation in Europe. And thirdly, Mr. Putin is giving us good incentives to think about security again in Europe.
And quite a bit of infusion here, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. So that's part of it. I sense a tremendous amount of hunger and actually a great opportunity for, I think, a new kind of American-Israeli-German conversation. On the other hand, there's a tremendous amount of ignorance and a lack. This is, surprising for an Israeli coming to Germany that tends to be very organized and institutionalized, but the actual number of institutions in Germany that do terrorism, that do security, that do defense issues is incredibly small.
Amichai, we didn't have any institutions for security. We had peace and conflict resolution centers.
Precisely. Yeah. So that is maybe a vignette that touches, I hope, on your first point.
Thank you. Diana, would you like to take? Would you like to take on the other context question?
Well, I think the historical context, I think there's really a massive, not just misunderstanding, but a massive different antithetical response to the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust that set Europe aside from Israel. And Europe has learned its lesson from the Holocaust. And that lesson is not the lesson that the Jewish world learned from the Holocaust. And the two may not meet ever, or maybe they will if Europe goes in the direction of the danger, having to become military again and defend European values. Until now, this nice, mushy, wonderful world of Europe felt very good about the fact that having been the horror center, having literally committed a genocide toward the Jews, what did it learn? We mentioned the Council of Europe earlier. We mentioned, the European Union earlier. What were the Grundgesetze of Europe, not just Germany? No more ethnic identity to identify a nation. No more Volksgesetz. No more religious definition of citizenship. The citizen being the nuclear element on which you build up the state rather than having the state build down. The human rights element. And then two other things that may be completely on the way out. Borderlessness as a value in itself. Historical reconciliation is almost the beginning of everything, the primus movens of a creation of a new. If you look at the Jewish situation, why was Israel created? It's a state for the Jews, by the Jews, and to protect the Jews. It's a state in which citizenship is not the key democratic element of a political contract. It's given. But, if you're an Arab citizen, it has a completely different, or people thought about it as an afterthought. It was not the point of the raison d'etre of Israel. And you can go on beyond the borders that never existed, and above all, historical reconciliation with whom? Did the Jews have to reconcile with Europe? Europe said, we didn't kill you. It was different nation states. So this whole notion with which you build this great European story makes no relevance to the Israeli context. Now, for Europe, it was always assumed that, the outpost of Israel would one day not have enemies anymore. So therefore, why do Europeans love to play the role of reconciling Palestinians and Israelis? Because it's built into their post-war DNA. But it's like reconciling apples and pears in the eyes of the Israelis. What does it mean? What are we talking about? Get out, scram back to your wonderful vacation monument museum Europe. We are out there on the front. And this is something that goes very deep. And when you touch the issue of the Jewish state, and whatever the definitions given by Israelis about this Jewish state, which is of course democratic and everyone can be Baha'i or Buddhist or Muslim in it. When you hear the word Jewish state, what do Europeans hear? A Croatian Christian state, an Estonian state with no Russians in it. The only ones who sort of laugh from afar are the French, who said our nation was always built as a notion. It's a voluntary act rather than a blood act, which is the distinction between Germany and France. So you have a real problem there, and I don't know how it can be solved. It's not a matter of goodwill, ill will, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. It's two entirely different lessons taken from the same historical tragedy. And right now, it seems to me that Europe was very proud of its universal Kantian categories. And everyone else had to fit in and felt that, America was a maverick on one end, Israel was the maverick on the other. But Europe had the real source and the real truth, and truth, toothless perhaps, but truth nevertheless. Now, we may be in a transformation moment because, thanks perhaps to Monsieur Putin, Europe may decide that soft power has limits. We don't know. But it's not something that is a matter of better publicity, greater marketing, selling. It is a conceptual divide which is between passive and active verbs in terms of an identity.
JD, thank you. I would also like to direct this conversation to the US as well. Even we are talking about Israel as an outpost. And again, I would like to pick this up. And even we might be, as a friend of mine has put it, driven into courage as Europeans by Monsieur Putin. There might be some conceptual differences between the US and Europe that have been sort of not that visible during the times of the Cold War, but become more visible. More and more often I hear from not the usual left-wing suspects that the US is an imperialist, spying country that has lately given us Guantanamo and the NSA. I hear it more often from conservative bourgeois German middle class. And I keep wondering the conceptual differences between the US and Germany or Europe, could they also be connected with what I just have lined out as post-militaristic, post-national, post-religious? Because also the US is neither of the three. And do you think that there have been profound changes in these relations as to, a kind of scrambling of the concept that we do belong to one, as we call it, Wertegemeinschaft, community of values?
Let me take a longer-term view for that for a second and put it into context from what I see. First, when we look at Israel, we looked at Israel as Americans, we look for security. Security has been dominant in what we've done. So the question is, are we vital in protecting and being part of security? And I can take a personal example. In 1973, I was in the 3rd Infantry Division when the Yom Kippur War broke out, and we were in the 3rd Infantry Division being prepared to go to Israel. That's the only time I remember where the United States would actually go to war for the survival of Israel. So the rest of the time we spent on the security debate, and we've defined our relationship in many ways of supporting through arms sales, through cooperation, through dealing with the Middle East peace process with the Northern Africans, trying to make clear that security was what we were really moving on. In the last few years, we've had a debate shift, and what you raised here is a very important shift to what about the values, and the debate in the United States has come to the occupation of the West Bank. What is it? What is a country that does this? Is this a democratic country, or do we believe that we should continue to support the security that we have? And there's some prominent people who've criticized it, Mearsheimer and Walt and others, who come out and said, is this an American interest to continue to do this? Well, then you add to that the debate that has now taken a really strong turn with Putin, and Putin's effort after the Balkan Wars, where Balkan Wars were really driven by ethnic nationalism, and ethnic nationalism is what Putin is talking about in Ukraine, and then you ask about the Jewish state. So how do we reconcile the question of a Jewish state that is ethnically defined, as you suggested, Diana, that Europeans have moved away from the ethnic definition. The United States never could have an ethnic definition. But nationalism is a very powerful movement, And how do we reconcile this? This is a debate that we're having in the United States. It's not anti-Semitism, although immediately in the debate, anytime you criticize, it becomes a question of anti-Semitism. It is a deeper one. It's even more concerning, I think, than the question of anti-Semitism. It's a question of what is it that we have in common? We have democratic values to fall back on, and the respect for minorities. And we've heard in this conversation today, there is respect for minorities, and minorities have a role, and the minorities are defined not only as ultra-Orthodox, but also the other minorities that are inside the Jewish community and minorities who are in the Arab community. So this is the debate that we get to. Are we in a period of post-nationalism? Well, clearly not in this area. Are we like the Europeans move beyond ethnicity as a definition? Well, clearly not. Is there military? Well, the military situation is good for Israel in that sense in this debate because we forgive the questions. We don't push the effort of what's happening in the occupation. We raise the issue, we discuss it, but we have not wavered on the commitment to Israel's security. So there's some real inherent tensions that happen in the democratic values that we're here to discuss, and the other national interests that we have are democratic interests. So those are the issues that we are really grappling with, and I'm not the only one dealing with these. We have lots of people here in this room who are trying to sort out what is it that we can do to promote democracy, promote the values that keep, as in the context of the conversation, Israel as an outpost for those very strong values while dealing with the security issue and with the change in the way the landscape is changing with Putin's intervention in Ukraine and what's happening with the European attitudes as they change.
Thank you. Anyone of you want to respond? Because otherwise we'd ask, because I'm sure you have plenty of questions. So go ahead.
I think we'll collect them probably.
Absolutely, we'll collect them. So we first have to get them before we collect them.
I'm sure that
Maybe they're not.
Don't tell me that you're tired, really.
that we didn't provoke you.
Because, or that you've been provoked too much by the concepts we had. Because, good.
Hi, my name's Verona. I'm a freshman in SIS. I came late, so maybe this was discussed. I'm not sure, but was the point, and maybe I'm going in another direction, but was the point of Zionism and the creation of a Jewish state to put, an outpost of the West in the Middle East?
Amichai, that's a question for you. Wait a minute. Wait a second. Very second.
No, I think.
Wait a second.
Wait a second. We go have one more question.
How much do you think the attitudes of Europeans toward the current conflict between Israel and Palestinians and Arabs more generally has to do with a pure lack of knowledge about what has happened over the years, and Europeans supposedly have a greater sense of history than other groups, but yet seem to have forgotten how Israel actually obtained that area.
Amichai, would you like to start and answer the questions?
Sure.
And
No,
Diana, would you like to also?
I will maybe pick up the issue, the question about Zionism and the West, and I think it's fair to say that the answer is no. I mean, there's no sort of kind of premeditated plan to create an outpost of the West. I'm not sure that Western conscious. We're talking about mid to late 19th century when this movement is getting going. I don't think that there's the same kind of. If the idea of the West existed at that time, it meant a very different thing. I would also say that Zionism was an outcome, in some respects, an aberration and an unplanned outcome of Jews coming to the conclusion that they will never be fully accepted in Europe because of the changes happening in Europe at the time. And this was one solution that people came up with among several solutions. Some people went to the United States, and some people joined the Bund movement and sort of became very integrated into German Viennese life, and so on and so forth, until the Dreyfus trials, showed that this was not. And Zionism was one solution amongst others. The other thing I think it's very important to understand is that Israel is a Western state and a Western society, but the Jewish people are native to the Middle East. Hebrew is native to the Middle East. Israelis are the people that we are most genetically like are Arabs. And of course,
are we talking genetics now?
No, I mean it's. The Jewish people came from the Middle East and returned to the Middle East, and in that sense, Israel is not a transplant. It's not a sort of a kind of a colonial transplant in the European sense.
Amichai, can I challenge you, please, on this one? Because in a sense, the interesting thing about Israel is that it is sort of an island of European modernity in a region that you could not call, that is struggling for 150 years to find its own path to modernity, which includes thinking about the place of religion within the state, that is about individualism, that is about participation in a political realm, etc., etc. And in that sense, I would say when it comes to the region, apart from the genetics, and I know the Palestinians and the Israelis are cousins in a genetic sense, but not in the sense of modernity, of what has developed over the short time span of 2,000 years since the Jews have left this region.
You see, I read it rather differently. First of all, the majority of people living in Israel today are not the descendant. They're not white Europeans. They're not most of them are not even the descendants of white Europeans. I'm married to a Moroccan. 90% of my friends are, married to Yemenites, Moroccans, Syrians, Libyans, and so on and so forth. Israel, in that respect, in many respects, is just a giant refugee camp where most of those refugees did not come from Europe. They came from North Africa and the Middle East. People forget this. But when they speak about a refugee problem in the Middle East, people tend to immediately think about Palestinian refugees. But we estimate that there were between 450,000 and 650,000, 700,000 so-called Palestinian refugees. There were almost 1 million Jews that were made refugees from Arab countries. Most of them came to Israel. And if you look at Israeli society today, it is even demographically primarily Middle Eastern, which makes the miracle of Israeli democracy and Israeli modernity even greater. I think that a lot of what you see, what Sylke is suggesting, can really be explained as a result of the need of Israel to survive in a very hostile environment. I don't think we would have survived unless we enjoyed consensus and legitimacy, which required democratic institutions and mobilization of society. We would not have survived unless we developed a high-tech industry. That high-tech industry did not come out of Silicon Valley. It came out of the Israeli military. In a way, the sort of the Charles Tilly thesis of states make war and war makes states. The Arabs made Israel. The Arabs were a very convenient spur to Israel to be a modern, technologically successful, open society, because on the one hand, they pose an existential threat to us and have done so over a 150-year period. On the other hand, they were not so overwhelming that they wiped us out. They created this kind of meso-level set of conditions that made Israel have to be pluralistic, democratic, but also technologically and militarily advanced, and to be a trading nation, to make sure that we have economic growth. So I read that reality rather differently from you, Sylke.
I just want to follow up, because I was asking this provocative question, but to say what Amichai just really said is one of the things that moves Americans. First of all, it's not just the Arabs that have come to Israel. You've taken in Russians, you've taken Europeans. It's an immigrant country that we can identify as Americans, clearly. And you fought for democracy in a very hostile environment. And in that hostile environment, yes, you've done things that we don't like, but we're Americans.
We've done things that you don't like.
Yeah, there are a few things that we could talk about, like in Iraq. But And you can
talking about slavery rather than Iraq.
But you also met the challenge, the intellectual challenge, and innovation challenge, and the kinds of things that speak to us as Americans. So I mean, while I may have tried to be provocative and ask the question, the answer that I get in talking to Americans is, look, there is a reason why you heard the Pew poll saying that we like Jews. Why? Because there are similar challenges that have been met and won in the same way that Israel has done them. There's still questions out there.
Diana, would you like to pick up this question on why there is still so little understanding, perhaps most on the European side?
Very quickly, the whole issue of Israel-Palestine and lack of knowledge. One should not minimize the fact that until 1967, Israel was very beloved across Europe as the small country that one was a symbol, and it's in an inverse proportion to those who are now seen as major enemies of Israel. Scandinavia probably came first. Every single Jewish institution had its headquarters in Paris because everyone was sort of boycotting London, given the whole mess of the Mandate period and how England had treated the rise of Israel from the Yishuv. Consequently, whether it's the joint American AJC, everyone had their offices in Paris, France being the best friend of Israel. In 1967, what happened? It's this notion of entering into the other line, beyond the green line, that starts creating a kind of feeling, incarnated naturally by General de Gaulle at first, that something goes wrong when you enter the other side and occupy. So this hasn't gone away. Now, whether they become heroes or the victim status, you can do the psychology, the post-colonial problems of it. The list is immense, so we'd have no time here as to why people started liking the Palestinians as the ultimate victims. But one has to understand that something happened, and that 1967 was a turning point. It seems to me that on this issue of Israel's future, and when I was provocatively saying that maybe Israel can sail away from our small, decadent world, is that if you put technology, if you put national identity, and if you feel that the international community, which is what the Europeans love, has mistreated Israel historically, and the Human Rights Committee at the United Nations is probably the apex of horror in terms of international references and picking on Israel, then you can imagine that Israel can go its very merry way, and I mean a very positive merry way, elsewhere, where their people will not constantly be referring to human rights in a distorted manner and don't care what happens to the Palestinians and take Israel for the power that it has become. Hence the incredibly almost physical fascination that the Chinese have for Israel. I mean, it's this huge elephant that looks at this little tiny speck of a mouse whose history is as long as theirs. The Chinese sit powerfully where they are, feeling, Europe was not even washing when we were already writing court poems. But there's only one group on earth that rivals them, and it's the Jews. And consequently, you can imagine, and I'm being provocative, but only up to a point, a very interesting new symbiosis that can be created with Israel remaining democratic, with its Supreme Court, battered as it may be in the future, I don't know, standing there, but feeling that it has other interests than just hanging around with countries that can only criticize it constantly because of human rights, because it's the only white power
and
that
because
colonizes,
we're such good friends.
because it's occupying and so forth. Why go there when the future is somewhere else?
Just to wrap this up, because we have to finish at 5 o'clock sharp, it really is a pity. We've had a quite interesting discussion in the Council on German Relations over the last time, what partnerships really are, especially strategic partnerships, and whether these partnerships don't have to be built on a common ground when it comes to a few fundamental things. So the Chinese option is really a very interesting one. But the one thing that I've taken away from the day of conference here and talking about what we have in common when we look at this triangle is, yes, the West is a shifting concept. We know that. And 50 years ago, or even 100 years ago, there were only two countries that could count themselves into what we thought was the West, and that was the US and Great Britain. and France, of course, 3 countries. And then for a while, France was not on board anymore, thanks to the Germans. Anyway, and now, especially with the emerging powers, the West looks pretty battered and bruised and very unsure of itself, which seems to explain why we have such difficulties very often to explain the differences. But there are a few elements that seem to really unite the countries we've been speaking about today. First of all is the rule of law. That's sort of the fundament number one, which leads to the next point, and that's sort of basically in accordance to the panels we've had today, market society, which has to be guaranteed, market economy, which has to be guaranteed by the rule of law and a certain extent of individualism, because without individualism there won't be competition, and without competition there is no market economy. And the third one, and very important one, is a civilized and peaceful dispute about the role of religion as institutionalized religion within society, and as to what it means to each and every individual and how they would like to define their kind of religiosity, non-religiosity, the way they want to use the treasure trove of history and culture, and a participation, a peaceful participation in what's going on in the society. And when I come back to what you've just offered, whether China or other countries could be new partners, I've been wondering about as to how much it plays a role that not so many of those countries offer all of these elements. So I thank you all very much.
No, well, actually, there was one. Well, look, Jews learned one thing from history. As long as we're not driven out, we stay here. I don't see anyone who's driving us out. I just know that Professor Boss at Sylke had a question. So that will be the last question, and then the concluding round, and then we'll leave voluntarily.
Okay, actually, I mean, to some extent the question was answered by Amichai before, but maybe if you can, some of you reflect on how people in Israel today, Jewish people in Israel today, think about themselves vis-a-vis the West, especially in light of the fact that the majority of the population is not originated in the West, even if we kind of expand the definition of the West to include the East European, which were the original Zionists. So is there still, given the fact that the West, some of the West seems to be more hostile to Israel, is there an urge in Israel still to kind of identify itself with the West?
Amichai, it's your question.
May I? First of all, so this allows me an opportunity to just respond to the point that Diana made, which is, why deal with these annoying, narcissistic, anti-Semitic Europeans? These are all in inverted commas. When it's a dying continent. They're in financial crisis. We're having babies, they're not. We can. The IDF can do stuff. If France had to defend itself today against the Russian, it's all over. There is that attitude in some segments of Israeli society. I believe that it's deeply misguided. I believe that Israel is an integral part of the West. That our own self-preservation, self-identity. I as an Israeli, view myself as part of the West and at the most fundamental level, and want to see that maintained. I want to see the West thriving and expanding for the foreseeable future. Now, that does not preclude closer relations with India or China, but I think it is fundamentally a question of Israeli identity that we are part of the free world. We are part of the West, and increasingly we want to we contribute to it, and increasingly we want to contribute to it. There is, secondly, a great sense of frustration about what I would call the wussy West, the growing inability of the West to stand up for Western values. I mean, look at the Arab Springs, and I just recently, together with German colleagues, carried out a large research project about external actors in the Arab Spring, the response of the EU, United States, Russia, Turkey, Iran, Israel to the Arab Spring.
It was a very small book, was it?
It wasn't a very small book, but what comes out of it is that Israel is exceptional in not having these Pollyannish notions that we're going to see rapid, democratization in North Africa and the Middle East on the one hand, and secondly, being able to say, you know what? When you set down red lines, you better be willing to enforce those red lines. And if as we say in Hebrew, according to reported media reports, Israel has enforced those red lines, and it's been the only country, the only power willing to do that. And by doing that, by the way, we safeguard not only our security but your security. So there's a sense in Israel that increasingly Europe and the United States are free riding on Israeli security provision in the Middle East. And that Pax Americana is being replaced by Pax Israeliana in North Africa and